Tim Flannery and Doug Hilton, our biological scientists. Charles Darwin, of course, wrote The Origin of Species, but this is just one of his works. With the recent celebration, though, of the 150th anniversary of this book, he's one of the most recognised scientists and writers. You both have backgrounds in biological sciences. Tim, you studied paleontology, and you're a haematologist, Doug.
Yep.
Where does the work of Charles Darwin sit on your bookshelf, Tim?
Well, it's pretty prominent, and I refer to quite a lot of it relatively frequently. The Beagle Voyage, the Origin of Species, of course, but really my favourite work is his book on worms, was the very last book he published. And worms had been a fascination of his all of his life, and he'd actually started experiments at Down House virtually when he arrived there with worms, and had continued them on through to his old age. And he was investigating how long it took worms to bury pieces of brick or whatever, and it's fascinating because in that book, Darwin, it's the one time that he comes close to a holistic worldview. He's very much the reductionist scientist. He studies evolution in all of its manifestations, whether it be orchids and moths and pollination, or in barnacles or whatever else. But in worms, he takes a step back, and we start seeing the way life influences the soil. The reason that Roman ruins are preserved in Britain, it's the work of worms. Right through to having worms as pets and seeing if they like the piano or the saxophone, through to and the sagacity and morality of worms is a topic that never ceases to fascinate him. So in that book we see a greater man in some ways, I think, than we see, the more complete man than we see in other books.
Now, Doug, you like his work on barnacles.
I do, yeah.
Tell me why.
I really like the fact that he spent 8 or 10 years in a very reductionist phase of his working life, at a time where he was capable of mulling over and ordering his thoughts on evolution and natural selection. And I think that pace of science is something that is missing today. I think would be a lovely luxury.
And Rachel, we think of astrophysics and pure mathematics, and Darwin doesn't come to mind, but Galileo comes to mind. Is Galileo an important person for you, and books about him?
Oh, absolutely, because in many ways Galileo was the sort of, not only the sort of front runner of modern astronomy. Of course, astronomy is the oldest scientific discipline, goes back many thousands of years, but this was the first time that instruments had actually been used to study the heavens. But the first observations by Galileo were stunning. He saw sunspots, he saw the phases of Venus, he saw the moons of Jupiter, all of that sort of thing. And that's a very fundamental part of what we learn and understand in astronomy. But the thing I think that really gets me very excited about Galileo, and it's something I've only really appreciated in the last few years, is that he was the guy who really understood and first formulated the scientific method. And that, of course, underpins everything that we do now. And he really understood that prior to that time the Church had decided, how the natural world would be interpreted, but Galileo said no, the natural world should be observed and measured, and of course that's the fundamental premise that we work from, and that was the reason why he had the major conflict with the Roman Catholic Church that he had. It wasn't because, of what he saw about the solar system and so on. It was because of that fundamental methodology that was at odds with the way the Church had interpreted the natural world.
Well, those are the big names, I suppose, in the fields. But I wanted to also talk about how you got into doing the kind of work you do. Doug, what made you want to be a haematologist and work in genomics? I suppose genomics wasn't invented when you started. But I know you were reading science fiction writers like Isaac Asimov's work. Did it help you choose your field at all?
Not so much. I found a science fiction an entertainment and a distraction, which was probably a good thing as a teenager. I had a fantastic biology teacher at a eastern suburbs high school, and she kept me interested, and then I think I really discovered my passion for research by doing it at ANU over summer, and did it in haematology and genetics and really haven't changed fields in 25 years.
I was thinking about Asimov, and then thinking about your work in haematology, and wondering whether you read or even seen the movie, the 1966 sci-fi movie Fantastic Voyage. Those people who get injected into the body and then go on this incredible voyage and see the inside of the body.
I have seen the movie and read the book, and it wasn't what got me involved in haematology. It was a much more. It was a much more prosaic book by one of my mentors, Don Metcalf, called Hemopoietic Cells, or Blood Cells, and I found that a fantastic read, and that's what has kept me working.
So, was it written in an accessible way, or how did it excite you?
Look, it was written in 1970, so it was a description of the development of the blood cells in the embryo and the different parts of the body the blood cells move to as the embryo develops, and I found that a fascinating topic. And it was just at the time where genes were beginning to be cloned, and that was still a heroic task, unlike today. And I really liked the idea of trying to understand all of the different genes that might contribute to this wonderful process, and still what my lab does now.
Well, Rachel, what led you to astrophysics? Was there a book involved? Please be there. Please be a book.
Look, unfortunately, there wasn't a book involved, and when I was thinking about this before the program, I was, sort of searching, trying to understand why it was, and then I realised that, when I started and got really hooked on cosmology, in fact, it was in an era before cosmology was written about in this sort of popular way. There'd been some books written in the 1930s, I would say, sort of James Jeans, Arthur Eddington and so on, but they were, a long way back for, somebody in the 70s and 80s. And that's because, modern cosmology really is since then. But the thing that hooked me in was as a Year 12 student, I went to Sydney Uni to a school on astronomy, and some guy lectured me on cosmology, and I was just completely blown away. And after I became a faculty member at Melbourne Uni, I went to Sydney Uni, and I was trying to figure out who it was who had given these fabulous lectures on cosmology. I knew all the cosmologists, and none of them were that good. I just couldn't imagine who it was. Anyway, I found the book of the course, and there was the name, and I didn't recognise it. Came back and asked my head of department. I said, "Who's Bob May? Well, in fact, Lord Robert May is now one of the most senior scientists in the UK, but he changed areas after that. He'd been a physicist, and then he moved into evolutionary biology and went to Princeton and then to the UK, where he became Tony Blair's science advisor and so on. So, not a book, but a person.
But I know an important book for you in your 20s that you've brought along, Philosophical Positions, Letters and Papers from Prison by Dietrich Bonhoeffer.
That's right.
What drew you to that work?
I've always, well, first of all, I grew up in the Christian tradition. I'm not a practicing Christian at this point in my life. So I read a lot of things in this area, and Bonhoeffer, was living in a very, well, his story is very poignant, I guess, but he's living under Hitler's Germany, and he was one of the few pastors who stood up and said, what is happening is not acceptable. And it's a very interesting story about somebody who's deeply embedded in conservative institutions and has, a political development sort of really going in a way that he found deeply unacceptable. But his notion, he struggled with a lot of these ideas and with the notion of what God was. And one of the ideas that I particularly liked in my youth was that he didn't try to put or to make an image of God that explained how the world was. So in other words, he didn't say, I don't understand this, therefore it's God. He had quite a different, he set God aside from that, understanding that we do learn new things, and God isn't the answer to what we don't understand. So it was that sort of notion that really appealed to me.
Was that quite unusual in your group, reading that sort of book?
I suspect so.
I suspect so too. Tim Flannery, you did your doctorate in paleontology, although I remember you were you did English literature as an undergraduate.
That's
and
right.
earth sciences. Was there ever a tussle between your interest in writing and reading literature and science?
Well, more of a continuity in a way. I studied English and history as an undergraduate and then did an MSc in geology, earth sciences, and then went on to biological sciences. But the continuity, I guess, has just been an interest in the past. I've always had an interest in the past, and I remember when I was a kid picking up Roy Chapman Andrews' expeditions to Mongolia to look for fossils. He was a paleontologist from the American Museum of Natural History who took the first motor vehicles into Mongolia looking for the skeletons of dinosaurs and things. This was incredibly exciting for me. But really, I think my interests were formed before that, and I've always seen history, prehistory, old books as just a continuum, and what I love about the whole thing is, you can pick up, well, here it is, there's Cicero's letters, you can pick that up and read or engage with the mind of a man who's been dead for 2,000 years, who had just dashed from the Roman Senate house to write something very interesting or mundane to his friend in Greece, and I just find that such an astonishing thing, and paleontology does that for me as well, when you actually dig up a bone or reveal it for the first time and see something about some vanished form of life. It's this connection that is very poignant somehow for me, and I guess I've got a view that most of the interesting people and things in the world are now dead, and so I love old books, I love old bones. I sort of tend to live in the past a bit, I suppose.
But I mean, that seems to be, is that your philosophy of writing too? Be like that Cicero who's just rushing off to explain what exciting thing has just passed in front of you or passed through your mind?
I love the candidness of it because Cicero didn't write for anyone. In fact, he was hoping his writings would never be seen by anyone, and he says that on occasion. Samuel Pepys is a bit the same. The 10-volume diary set is just one of the great pleasures of my life, that book. And it's that engagement with a totally candid mind. It's like a friend that is totally trusting and wonderful. And there's something about that in paleontology. I had an experience just last week that sort of brought it home to me in the fossil realm. I was visiting Flinders University in South Australia and was shown two pieces of Aboriginal art, rock art, of immense antiquity, both of which were depictions of the marsupial lion, an animal that's been extinct for 50,000 years and which I've known only through bones. So to see that animal through the eyes of a long dead person who actually knew it made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up on end. And it's that same thrill, really, I think, of connecting with the past.
So if we were to take a tour of your bookshelves, we would find explorers, we'd find what kind of science books? Who are the important scientists who can write?
Well, it's a bit eclectic. I've got a big section on 17th century science, so Robert Boyle, the Royal Society, Francis Bacon, all of that sort of stuff. And then I've got quite a lot of 19th century works because it was another period of tremendous activity. Svante Arrhenius, Darwin, Wallace, all of those sort of people. But I've also got a lot of 19th century exploration and earlier exploration as well, going right back. I've got a lot of classics. I love the ancient Roman world because it's so bloody modern. When you read Cicero or any of the, Caesar, it's the modern world. That was the first modern city, and it's as if, what is amazing to me, it's as if there's a template in the mind waiting to be unleashed once a certain critical mass is reached, and it's just then manifests itself. So I've got a lot of old books, and I guess from 20th century books I tend to read classics. I've got, The Origins of Virtue by Matt Ridley is there. I don't know what else I've got in here. In the 20th century, there's not a lot. Richard Dawkins' A Selfish Gene, tremendously incisive and tremendously flawed. John Keynes, you can't, as a read, Keynes is extraordinary. His biography of Malthus is amazing. But
we'll come back to some of those. But you mentioned Alfred Wallace, and Doug, I know that Alfred Wallace is on your list.
Absolutely.
The competitor to Darwin. Tell me why.
I really like Wallace's story, his life. I like the fact that I admire the fact that he went to South America as a young man. His brother died of yellow fever, I think, very quickly afterwards, and he spent a few years collecting various insects, and then embarked on the trip back to London only to have his boat burned to the ground with all of his specimens on that was going to make him famous and earn him a living. And then the fact that he spent 18 months in London dusting himself off and then went to Southeast Asia for the next 10 or 15 years and made so many contributions to natural history. I think I find that courage and persistence admirable, and perhaps a mirror for the life of a lot of scientists, perhaps not in such a dramatic way, but science, experimental science, is very much an up and down life.
What about Stephen Jay Gould, thinking about a more modern writer? He was a paleontologist, evolutionary biologist, historian of science. Does his work make it into your collections? I think, Rachel, you've read that.
I have read a couple of them.
I mean, I think my and Tim's bookshelves are pretty similar. So I really enjoyed Ontogeny and Phylogeny, which is one of Stephen Jay Gould's early books, and talks about the parallel between embryology and evolution, and points out some of the fallacies there. But I found that an immensely readable book, and a book that triggers a whole lot of different ideas as a biologist.
It's interesting, and I guess I've got a little bit of Gould, but I've got more of Wilson, Ed Wilson, who's the great protagonist, But if I just...
Got to choose sides in these things?
No, but you've only got so much reading time in a day, and you've got to just allocate it properly. But if I could just say a word about Wallace, because he's fascinating for a number of reasons. He starts off as a biologist, but by the time he's 80, he has written this amazing book called Man in the Universe, which is really the foundation text of astrobiology. It is an argument that life is unique to planet Earth. There's no life on Venus or Mars. And in fact, he comes up with his argument that we are the centre of the universe and the raison d'etre for the universe, which of course is very anthropocentric. But he gets there through a very interesting argument where he explains the nature of the atmosphere and its relationship to life. It's a very holistic and fascinating view. So he's
on top of that,
genuine hero.
Was his spiritualism, which he came on as not as an old man, part the way through his life. And I think that's perhaps one of the reasons I find Dawkins' more strident books to be a little bit specious. And that is somebody with very mixed up types of faith can still make wonderful contributions to science. So the idea that it's either one or another seems to me to be a little odd.
Exactly, and of course his opposition to immunisation as well, which would cost countless lives possibly, but was based on such a strong view that it is dangerous to put something from one body into another body, which today we'd all acknowledge in the face of the AIDS epidemic. He just didn't see the cost-benefit ratio.
Well, Rachel, this is a crossover area, isn't it, about life on Earth and life in the universe. One of the questions you want to answer in your work is why life has evolved in the universe. Tell me about this book, Life as We Do Not Know It, by astrobiologist Peter Ward.
Astrobiology is of course one of the very new areas in astronomy now, and as we're starting, we found hundreds and hundreds of planets out there around other stars, and of course the main aim of this is not just to find the planets, but to find a planet where there might be life. And so astronomers, they're sort of Johnny-come-latelys, I guess, to this game, but they're starting to think about how will we find life? What are the signatures that will tell us that life exists on one of these planets that we've discovered out there? And so this opens up lots of very interesting questions, and of course it follows through to the next most obvious question, which is what is life and how does it start? Why does it start? And setting aside the sort of religious answers to that question, from the point of view of physics now, it becomes an extremely interesting question because life in fact runs against physical principles. We have notions of how of energy and how molecules should organise themselves. Life, in fact, goes in the opposite direction from a natural physical system.
That because we're going towards order rather than away from order.
Exactly. And so the question then about what triggers this, what is it that actually reorganises molecules to behave in this different way becomes a very fascinating one. And it's a bit strong to say that, it's something that I work on, it's something that I teach, but it's not. At this stage, it's not something I scientifically feel that I could make a major contribution to, but it's absolutely fascinating.
Now, Rachel, while we've got you talking, I wanted to talk to you about the responsibility of scientists, and their role is often presented as progressive. But in physics, the history of the bomb and involvement of physicists gave a different perspective on this. You've brought a book along by Martin Rees, the president of the Royal Society, and your former supervisor at Cambridge. The book is called Our Final Hour: A Scientist's Warning: How Terror, Error and Environmental Disaster Threaten Humankind's Future in This Century, on Earth and Beyond. He's got the American disease for impossibly long titles. But what's the book about? Why have you bought it?
Okay. In fact, the book sounds very doomsday and doom and gloom and so on, but in fact it's not. What it does is it engages with the really big questions of our time and tries to understand what our role is and what our role should be in coming to terms with them. So he does, of course, talk about the nuclear issues, although I think that Martin would say that these issues are not as pressing as they perhaps were 20 or 30 years ago. I think, and I know this view is not completely shared by all physicists, but because the Cold War is no longer, these are not issues that are right on the front of physicists' minds. But he also deals obviously with climate change and just the evolutionary pressures that human beings are putting on the Earth at this stage. So, we live on a finite planet with finite resources, and the question is, where are we going? Can we actually see a future, 1,000 years hence, that we, as we currently exist now, are part of? And I guess his answer to that is that 1,000 years into the future, it's hard to see that we'll be living like we are now. And climate change isn't the only reason for that. He's also exploring, sort of disease and the possibility that another disease, even more virulent than AIDS, for example, might take hold. All of those sort of issues are on the table. It's a very, Martin is a very broadly read scientist. It's a book that's well worth reading.
What about you, Tim? You've taken a very active position as a scientist in conservation and water use, climate change. Are there books that you are involved in reading? I know you write them, but who are your models for the role of the scientist in the public sphere?
Well, I've got everything that James Lovelock has ever read, I think. He's another one of these profoundly influential people who has come...
His story?
Well, he started really as an air hygienist. He got his PhD during the Second World War. He was a Quaker and a pacifist during the war. He wouldn't fight. So he was assigned to look at air raid shelters and the quality of air, and he found that in some of them oxygen levels were down to 13%, so he couldn't light a cigarette, which drove people crazy, but no one noticed the effects of low oxygen levels. And he went on to study that as his PhD, and from there became involved with understanding the nature of the atmosphere. And his major breakthrough occurred in the 1960s, I think, when he'd developed a machine that could detect almost unimaginably low levels of material in the atmosphere, so parts per billion. And he looked at some man-made chemicals, manufactured chemicals, and realised they were everywhere, instantaneously everywhere. And that then started to open his mind to the nature of the atmosphere. And then, of course, with that knowledge, he went to the Jet Propulsion Lab in California in 1975 with Carl Sagan. Was looking at the results that had come through about the gaseous or the nature of the atmosphere of Mars and Venus, and realised immediately that there could be no life on either planet. Carbon dioxide, a planet eternally at rest. And that was really made him think about Earth as a living entity.
Doug, what about in your area? Biotechnology, uses and abuses of biotechnology. Who should we read for that?
Look, that is a really good question. I'm not sure I can give you the answer. I think I've seen the influence more by scientists engaging by talking with the community. Gus Nossel is a great example of somebody who doesn't sit in an ivory tower and talks about the importance of fighting disease and acts through organisations like WHO to really tackle important problems, and the Gates Foundation now. So I've seen it more in terms of words and action than the written word.
So we've stopped talking so much about the threat of new biology or nuclear weapons, but we're talking about the economy a lot, the threat of the economy. And Tim, you mentioned you've got economists in your collection, John Maynard Keynes and Adam Smith.
Yeah, and Ricardo and Say and all of those great thinkers. I mean, they're fascinating because the older economists, particularly Adam Smith, are not dealing just with money. They're dealing with the nature of the human condition. And money as being a manifestation of that, and the economy as being a manifestation of that. And Keynes is, I think, of a similarly broad view. And I just find their writings fascinating, very challenging to understand sometimes, but very fascinating. And Kenneth Galbraith is another one in that grand tradition. His short history of economics is, again, one of my favourite reads.
And what do you think about the economists implying that they are sort of scientists, that they're creating models, that, they're starting to claim that they can predict things? I mean, doesn't that get under your skin?
No, I'm the best of them are social scientists in a sense and see the bigger picture. There are another group of economists who are simply interested in maximising profit or making money from the stock market, and they bore me to tears. But the truly great economists, I think, have a lot of very important things to say about the nature of the human condition.
Rachel, you also read a lot about women in science. One of the books that you mentioned was The Mind Has No Sex. Tell us about that.
Yes, this is a book exploring the history of the participation of women in science, and tracing the contributions that women have made in science, which are, of course, not widely known, and just trying to understand exactly why that is. And then, of course, during the 19th century and through the beginning of the 20th century, women were really discouraged from participating in science much more actively. And I think really it's only in the last 20 or 30 years that has turned around again. It's not surprising as a woman scientist that I have an interest in this and trying to understand, exactly what the sociology that has shaped, women in science is, why these things have happened. But one of the things I'm particularly interested in is whether or not women contribute to science in a different way from male scientists. In other words, can they bring something fresh and different to doing science?
Can they?
Yes. I believe so. It's obviously, scientists are a continuum. There's no black and white here. But I think that women tend to be more cooperative and sort of come with a less personally aggressive agenda in their science, perhaps, than the male cohort. And I've made Doug smile now.
What do you think about that, Doug?
I think some women might come with a personally less aggressive agenda. Like, it's a huge issue, and it's one where we're perhaps it's perhaps even more acute in the biosciences. So we've been in a situation for 30 or 40 years where the majority of our PhD students and our postdoctoral scientists are women, and yet women still find enormous barriers to moving to independent positions and professorial positions. So I've been very sceptical of the idea of the trickle-down, that if only in the physical sciences we could get to 50-50 is an input for women into maths and physics, that somehow equity will be sorted out at the higher levels. I think that's a misconception, and I think if we can't solve it in the biosciences, then there's not a lot of hope for the other sciences.
Can we talk now about reading for specific projects that you're working on? Now Tim, for your work in New Guinea, you had the Italian explorer biologist Luigi Maria d'Albertis and biologist Jared Diamond go before you. Both wrote about their work. How did their writing prepare you?
Well, Luigi Maria d'Albertis's two-volume What I Did and What I Saw in New Guinea is one of the classics of New Guinea exploration writing. He was the first European to get into the mountains of New Guinea and see the alpine, or not alpine, but forest fauna from very high up. He was an impossibly romantic character as well, who spent years in New Guinea and went up the Fly River with Lawrence Hargraves in a steamboat. And his diary, or the book, consists of very extensive daily journal. So you get everything in there. And he's fascinating because all of the paradoxes that any biological collector has inherent in them, he just expresses so beautifully. So he goes up into the hills with native local people. He's not sure whether the people are going to kill him or help him. They end up helping him. They actually take him out and show him some display trees where birds of paradise are displaying. And then, of course, he has to shoot them, because that's his job. And this great moment happens when he shoots his first male bird of paradise and rushes over to it and says, and there he is on his marriage day with his beautiful groom's suit on, and I've put blood all over it and killed this magnificent thing. It's a fantastic and very truthful and honest and wonderful account of life in New Guinea. And in some ways, he's rather alien because I'll just give you one example. He's going down the Fly River with his cook, a Fijian by himself, and the cook goes out to get firewood one day and comes back with a human head, obviously freshly hacked off someone he's just met on the road, because Fijian cannibals, right? And Luigi says, "Oh, you've been a very naughty boy," he said, "but I'll take the head back to Professor Poglioli because he'll be very interested." Sort of like, it's a totally alien world, but fascinating.
Well, hopefully you picked up a few useful tips from him.
Well, yeah, possibly.
Rachel, what about you? The work you do on quasars and developing bigger and better telescopes to see further into space suggests that your day-to-day reading would be in very specific journals.
That's right. All of our work is not published in the sort of books that normal people would want to read. They're journal articles, and they're really quite dense, and you require quite a lot of specialist knowledge, by and large, to even start to access them.
But do you ever come across someone who's written in such a way that it's exciting? I mean, I know that you're supposed to be writing in the past and in the third person, but does somebody sometimes break through?
Just occasionally, but most of us, unlike Tim, are not, real literary talents, right? And so we do tend to write in a fairly standard sort of way, clearly, but not particularly exciting. So,
Doug, what about you? You'd be a journal man, wouldn't you?
I'm certainly a journal man, and look, there are journal articles that you read over a period of time. I agree with Rachel; they're few and far between. But I remember reading a paper when I was in Boston at MIT as a postdoc by a guy called Richard Axel, who had worked out the molecular details of the sense of smell, and it was the most elegant paper, beautifully written. I find the approaches that people use are often much more exciting to me than the details of their results, because I can juxtapose those approaches with what I'm trying to do in the laboratory as well. I find that a very exciting piece of reading.
I should just say, in paleontology, of course, we read a lot of journal articles as well, and I find it exactly the same as you. It's often the techniques that people use that are fascinating, particularly in contemporary paleontology, where people are resorting more to geochemical things that were just unthought of when I was around, and even ancient DNA and this sort of stuff. It's amazing.
Let's talk about fiction. Let's not leave fiction out, because Rachel, one of stereotypes of astrophysicists is they like sci-fi. What about you?
I'm afraid not.
Why not?
Oh, well, look, there have been a couple of exceptions, but by and large, when I start reading science fiction, I just get annoyed, actually.
Because you keep saying it couldn't happen like that?
Yes.
What about someone like Fred Hoyle? Because I thought of him when I read your CV, and I thought, well, Fred Hoyle was an astrophysicist. He wrote, A for Andromeda, and lots of other science fictions. But his big idea, wasn't it, that life was seeded from comets on Earth, and that I thought, well, that might appeal, but no, I can see it.
No, Fred Hoyle is a magnificent writer, and his stories are very engaging, and they're almost credible. He, in fact, took some of those stories into science, and then it became less credible.
What about Doug? You'd be a bit of a sci-fi nerd.
I certainly was a bit of a sci-fi nerd when I was growing up. I probably haven't read sci-fi for pleasure for a long time.
Are you as annoyed as Rachel is?
No, I'm clearly, it's not my area, and therefore I have no capacity to work out whether it's realistic or not. So that never annoyed me at all. Rachel's much smarter than I am.
What about Isaac Asimov's, though, Foundation series?
Yeah, I really enjoyed reading those as a teenager, because I think it had a little bit to do with biology as well, and psychology, and I've gone back and reread those on occasions. They're certainly enjoyable books.
Any fiction at all?
I read lots of fiction at the moment, often the books my 15-year-old son's reading. So
for school?
No, for enjoyment. He's an avid reader, where the 13-year-old isn't, and I get a lot of enjoyment reading kind of fantasy, Philip Pullman type novels. I'm not sure whether that's science fiction or fantasy or somewhere in between. I enjoy reading what he reads.
What about you, Tim? Are you a fiction connoisseur?
Not really. I must admit I don't read a lot of fiction, and what I read is some of the stuff that perhaps wouldn't be called fiction, but that I studied as a student. So I still read Shakespeare, which I just love, some of the ancient Greek tragedies and some of the classical works, and Jane Austen, which I really enjoy. But I enjoy it, I think, as much for the historical connection as for the fiction, for the inventiveness of it. And I suppose Jeanette Winterson, among modern fiction writers, is the one who I would get real pleasure from. I find her work, she is the sort of modern Shakespeare in a way. She's got such a beautiful way with words, but so relatively few.
And so your literature education hasn't turned you on to fiction in the modern world?
Well, look, there are exceptions. I'm just trying to remember. There's a Canadian writer, a woman who, I'm just trying to remember, the Winter Garden, I can't remember her name, and I really enjoyed reading her fiction work. Peter Carey, Illiwacker, I read, but they're sort of occasional compared with the volume of other reading I do.
I was surprised, Rachel, with the I Ching on your list.
Dao De Ching, actually. Yeah.
Tell me about that book and
well, it's not fiction.
No, yeah, I know.
It's a Chinese, I guess you'd sort of call it philosophical tome, and I do read it. I still read it a lot, and it's partly because I find it completely juxtaposed against the sort of Western philosophy that, as a scientist, I live in. So it's a very different way of looking at the world, and a much very removed from the sort of Western notion of science, sort of manipulating and sort of handling of the material world. This is a very hands-off sort of approach. I enjoy. It's stimulating.
And poetry?
A little, yes.
What poetry do you like?
Oh, well, 19th century poetry by and large. So Yeats, Blake, those sort of poets are generally the ones that I read.
Doug, I'm amazed that you've got time for this, but you describe yourself as an amateur entomologist as well.
Yeah, so, and that's relatively recent in the last 10 years. I found, I used to annoy my wife a lot because when we used to go on holidays, mainly camping in bits and pieces of the Victorian bush, I used to be itching to get back to the lab, and within 2 or 3 days would be bored of the holiday and be trying to find reasons why we had to go back to Melbourne early. And through reading and through reading about Darwin and Wallace and another book that I bought in, Nabokov's Blues, I think I got interested in the idea of taxonomy as a hobby. And once I'd realised that there was a large undescribed fauna of moths in Australia, I felt that I could go on holidays and I had something to do. So I collect moths when I'm on holidays. Absolutely, and I've become a very, very good taker of holidays.
Well, what are you reading at the moment? What's on the bedside table?
I think I have about 20 books piled up on the bedside table, very eclectic. Some of them are pretty hardcore moth taxonomy books. Others are...
Hardcore?
Yep.
Sounds pornographic.
Like always dissecting genitalia. So both my sons find that immensely embarrassing. A number of current books of fiction, books I'm rereading, lots of different things.
What about you, Rachel?
I'm actually reading Edmund White's autobiography, which he's a very fine writer, and it's very interesting. And then the other vice I have, I actually read detective stories. I find them very relaxing, and so one of my recent finds is Nuri Vertace, whom I thoroughly enjoy. So
I have a big pile of Scandinavian fiction, detective fiction on my table as well. So
Larson.
Yeah, Stieg Larsson, but there's a whole host of authors that are pretty entertaining, and I do find it also a wonderful distraction from work.
indeed.
What about you, Tim? What's on your bedside table?
Well, I've got Cicero, Caesar, the Gallic Wars, Pliny the Elder, natural history, his history. I've got The Great Penguin Rescue, which I'm reviewing, which is a fantastic read.
Great Penguin Rescue.
Yeah, it's about what the consequences of oil spills on penguin populations, but it's written by a penguin rescuer. So this woman is this fantastic person who just gets involved in all of this, and it's really her experience rescuing penguins. And it's quite fascinating, complicated business actually to rescue a penguin. Honeybee Democracy, I'm reading.
Honeybee Democracy?
Yeah.
About honeybees?
About honeybee democracy. It's literally the way that they count votes, the way bees count votes, which is very interesting sort of thing.
How bees count votes?
Yes, yeah, and under what circumstances.
We could learn something.
Who gets to vote? Exactly. Well, there's a parallel one is the leaf cutter ants I'm reading as well, which is another account of essentially of ant democracy, which is very different from bee democracy.
Ant democracy.
Yeah, ant democracy is more like ours because everyone gets to vote. Honeybee democracy's different because it's an oligarchy. Only the oldest and wisest bees gets to vote. So there might be 10,000 in the hive and only 400 will get to vote. But
sounds like the Roman Empire.
Yeah, it is similar, but it is. It's sort of like the old Senate, exactly. But it's interesting stuff. So. Yeah.